Thank you so much for joining me today. Super excited to have this conversation about the importance of podcasting, especially when it comes to Canadian culture. I saw, like you probably did, the news over the past few days that podcasting has just overtaken news insofar as the way that at least most Americans are getting their news information. So I think here in Canada, it's worth having a serious conversation about podcasting. Before we get into it, tell me a little bit about what you guys do.
Yeah, so Jar Audio is a podcast production agency that works exclusively with brands. So we get hired by big brands like Amazon, Lululemon, Expedia to craft podcasts that engage with their specific audiences and solve business challenges.
And so one of the things that has been on my mind as the co-founder since we started Jar over 8 years ago is the fact that we make podcasts with brands because brands have the budget to make podcasts. And they have some great stories to tell and some great interesting angles, right? But there are a lot of other stories that exist outside that branded space in Canada that are not getting told because they're not getting funded. And so we've been thinking and talking to other people in the industry and just thinking about how can we change that so that there's a lot more recognition around the different kinds of stories that can be told through podcasting.
It's really interesting when we think about the history of podcasting because, as you well know, it's not a short history. I am coming up on 20 years pretty much of doing podcasts on a regular basis. It's a format that has been around for a long time. But I think it's also fair to say that in the early years of podcasting, it certainly didn't have the influence that it does now. It was really a very niche kind of geeky format in terms of the audiences. Maybe I can ask you, Jen, just in terms of what you're seeing, how big do you see the podcast market in Canada today as far as the influence it's having on Canadians?
Well, I think that influence has, grown exponentially since Canadians lost access to the ability to share news links because of decisions that were made by Meta to prevent the sharing of URLs and news links of Canadian source news. So Canadian people have been sort of essentially forced into the arms of podcasting if they want to get access to homegrown stories and news. And so that's why there's this imperative to really try to fund those things properly right now, because that is Canadians have sort of nowhere to go, right? They need to get their stories and they need access to them through podcasting. Yeah.
It is true that it's a bit of a news desert right now in our social spaces, which I think is so concerning. We've actually been doing a segment on this show called News Matters, where we talk to local news organizations. And it's just a really difficult conversation to see that these news organizations have lost a lot of their reach and engagement because of what's happened with Meta blocking news. At the same time, it is also true that some of those news organizations do have funds that they can go to. They are supported and have the ability to be supported, I think, in different ways. Podcasting doesn't really have that. So is there an example around the world of a country that does invest and support podcasting in a more serious way?
That's a good question. I think until recently, the United States had a lot more funding, and those things are under threat right now. And they're fighting their own fight south of the border, and we wish them luck. But we really need to focus on our fight here to get our voices heard. And I think so. I'm not sure, actually, if there is an example of a really well-funded podcast infrastructure. But I think what's uniquely Canadian about us, what's unique about Canada, is that we do put our money where our mouth is when it comes to wanting to get our CanCon across. And that's what the CBC is, arguably. That's why the CBC gets funding. And they make wonderful podcasts. They just don't make enough of them. And so our argument is that right now the CBC is like the company store of podcasting. and we need to diversify. We need to broaden and diversify that landscape. The other thing is that, I think it's 40% of Canadians say that they listen to podcasts monthly. And multi-generational listening is growing. 82% of kids co-listen with their parents. The other thing that's changed since podcasting started out is that like multilingual podcasting and BIPOC audiences are growing fast. Um, but still, most of our listening hours in Canada go to international, mostly American shows. So we're essentially losing our own audience. And we really think we've got to stop doing this, especially right now in the current political situation that we're in with, tariffs on, tariffs off, already language around tariffs on Canadian content and Hollywood North, and that whole film industry being critiqued. There's nothing preventing that from happening to podcasting. So we really need to kind of take stock of ourselves here in Canada and make sure that we're delivering on the promise of our own industry.
And so what, all we're asking for is for the federal and provincial governments to take podcasting as serious, as serious as it needs to be, because it is now a world-class, medium, and Canada is doing an incredible job at it, but could be doing, a lot better. So right now, the current public funding is lacking, whether it's through the CMF or the, Canada Council. It excludes almost all podcasting, and video podcasting, actually. That's audio and video podcasting. So it's sort of the equivalent of saying we support TV, but not the internet, which is absolutely nonsense. So, like Jen said earlier, unless you're the CBC, you have to beg brands to support you, and we feel that it should be, better done, on a federal level and provincial level as well.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it's not to take away from what both the federal government and any provincial governments are investing in terms of Canadian content, but just more the inclusion of what is obviously a new medium that is drawing so many people in. When you think about the future of podcasting in Canada, I think there is the desire in terms of having more funding, more access to funding for podcasters. But there's also an infrastructure that's set up online that I think is hard to break into. We were talking before the interview that even if you look at the podcast charts, I mean, they are largely dominated by large American podcasters. Do you think there's anything more that we can do, whether it's funding or, maybe we need our own podcast stores, which do exist, but again, they have American shows, so you can't really compete with those numbers. What else can be done to actually nurture what is more and more this compelling and important space?
That's a great question. I mean, we do have some interesting initiatives underway. For example, there's the Pod the North newsletter, which is a great newsletter by Katie Lohr that takes a look at various initiatives in the Canadian podcasting world. So I would recommend people check that out. And I mean, one of the realities of the podcasting industry that we're noticing is that when we do see funding for it, it tends to really not acknowledge the actual cost of producing a podcast. So the actual cost of producing a good podcast and marketing it effectively is significant. And it needs to be treated like any other medium, film or television. These are hard costs, these production costs. You got to hire voice actors. You got to go on location sometimes. You got to have lights on. You got to have mics on. All those things cost money. And I think there's this tendency, because podcasting is created using accessible tools, there's not a tendency to recognize it as a professional endeavor that costs money to make. But to do it well and to do it in a way that is really going to surface and sing, you actually have to, there is a certain amount of a pay to play kind of aspect to it, right? You have to have marketing budget, for example, would be something that I think any funding allocation should take into account.
But if you do fund it and it is done well, the payoff is incredible. I mean, when we, just looking at the data, when you look at the average YouTube video, let's say that isn't a podcast, on average, each video is being watched a minute to 5 minutes, let's say. On the flip side, in audio with a podcast, we're talking about, usually 90% of every episode of a 30-minute episode. So the stories are actually being enjoyed and watched and listened to, and whatever it's talking about is actually is sinking in.
Yeah, I mean, I've even noticed just my own habits. This is purely anecdotal, but more and more I'm watching YouTube content of podcasts that people are creating. And that has become kind of like my TV viewing, right? I may not tune into traditional television much anymore, but I'm consuming my content in these different places. And really, quite frankly, mostly YouTube. That's kind of the go-to place for some of that video. And it is kind of podcast after podcast. I think we can probably all agree that we need to do more. I think it's also fair to say that, especially if we look to our southern neighbors, like podcasting has enormous influence even over how people vote. We saw that in the last U.S. election. I think
they called it the podcasting election.
Exactly.
That was what it was nicknamed, right? In the same way that Twitter helped Obama get elected. Definitely, Joe Rogan and the boys helped Trump get elected. He appeared on way more podcasts than his opponent, and there was a result to that. He was able to sway more people.
Yeah, and we're seeing that here too. I think to a certain extent, we're slower, but it's starting to happen, right? We're seeing politicians go on podcasts. We're even seeing politicians launching podcasts. I mean, this is not a medium that isn't accessible anymore. So what can?
But even just in that case of let's say Mark Carney and the past election, his most successful podcast interview was with Scott Galloway, an American professor, an incredibly sort of American-centric show. But in order for him to get his message far and wide, he had to go there versus a Canadian voice.
Well, I'm still sore because I put in a request to interview him as well, but I enjoyed that interview too. But I couldn't agree more. I mean, we have to at some point start to actually support our Canadian creators and podcasters, because it's one of these things, like, you can't expect this industry to continue to grow and people to be able to be independent if these aren't the first places that you turn. Right. If we're not going to do that, if our highest leaders in the country aren't sort of turning to some of these peoples and continue to go to the U.S., I mean, that's not helping either. What do you think people can do insofar as supporting this initiative that you've launched to try to have an impact on some of these decision makers to have more funding accessible?
Well, the first thing you can do is, if you're an executive in the podcast industry currently and you're listening or watching the show, you can go to jaraudio.com. Check out our blog there, because we've got a post that we just put up this morning. We're looking for folks in the industry to sign a letter that we're sending to federal government and provincial to get podcasts taken a lot more serious.
Yeah. So that's the first thing. I mean, but the second thing is call your local MP, call your local MLA, tell them you care about Canadian voices, tell them you care about Canadian content, tell them that you think podcasting is central to that and that it should be better funded. I mean, this is an issue to do with our democracy and our social discourse that is very, very important. And we have seen south of the border this kind of gradual dissolution of discourse. And I think what we need is to ensure that who we are and who we want to be as a country is well represented in the voices that surface through podcasting, in that sort of, I'll call it a kind of Wild West ecosystem of different voices. We need to make sure that there's diversity there. We need to make sure that is being kind of consciously funded. The other really quick point I want to make is that as traditional media shrinks, and regular journalists get laid off, and journalism school graduates graduate with no jobs to go to, podcasting is picking up that slack, but without a lot of support to grow. And I think that's something else to consider. Yeah.
Absolutely. So some big opportunities, I think, for Canadian podcasters, and also I think some action that people can take to help support this industry as well. I wanted to thank both of you for joining me on the AmberMac show and talking about this subject. I'm always thrilled to see and hear more conversations around podcasting. It's such a powerful medium, and there's such great work being done in this country. So thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amber.